Last episode, we talked about the process of applying to asylum in Europe, but what we didn't talk about is what happens after that precious moment when an asylum seeker is granted status and they officially become a refugee of the state. It's tempting to think of refugees as only people in flight, always on the move, but never quite arriving. But I think this affects the narrative we hear, which kind of stops once an asylum seeker has been granted protection and becomes a recognised refugee, because they're no longer in flight, so the story ends there, right? The hardship is over, and they can go on their merry way to start a brand new life. But like with most things, it's just not that simple. How do you navigate a country you've never been to, where you might not even speak the language? Where do you go? How do you find work? Do your children go back to school? What do you do when it becomes safe to return home? And what happens if it never does? Today we'll be using Cologne, Germany, as a case study to try to understand this period of time after flight and what happens when cultural norms and values on both sides are challenged. This is Motion, a podcast about migration in the 21st century. I want to glance back briefly to our discussion on the EU's Dublin regulation. This was the rule that essentially required that asylum seekers make their asylum claim in the first EU country they arrive in. By late summer of 2015, the number of refugees fleeing to Central and Western Europe had increased dramatically. And so, on August 25th of that year, Germany made the bold decision to suspend the Dublin regulation for Syrians.
Around 900,000 people came to Germany to seek asylum in 2015. While some said Germany could not cope, others argued the new arrivals would boost the country's workforce.
The idea of a culture of acceptance became a major part of the German political discourse, and it stood in stark contrast to the slowly degrading relationship between other EU states and asylum seekers. But with this adapted law and newly welcoming attitude came an obvious influx of asylum claims to Germany. In 2015 alone, the country received an estimated 430,000 applications for asylum seekers. That's more than a third of the total number of asylum claims made to the EU that year. Prime Minister Angela Merkel's decision was controversial, to say the least, and she hasn't been without her critics.
When the German Chancellor Angela Merkel opened the door to nearly 1 million refugees in 2015, she was on her own. A gamble many at the time said would cost her her political career.
As Doris Akerap wrote in The Guardian, a culture of acceptance was not born of custom, but created to establish one. But now, Germany is in the thick of this process of creating a welcoming culture, and among the challenges it's facing is figuring out where to house its growing refugee population and how to integrate them into society. North Rhine-Westphalia is the largest of Germany's 16 states, with approximately 18 million people. It's also home to 1/5 of Germany's refugees. I visited Cologne, the largest country in the state, because I wanted to see how the country was coping with its new refugee population. Most importantly, I wanted to get a better understanding of what life is like for those for whom Cologne has become their new home. Within Cologne, there is a wide array of programs that provide assistance for refugees trying to adjust to life in this new country. Integrating refugees is a top priority for aid workers in the area, both so that refugees can gain back some control over their lives and so that they can contribute to Germany's economy and society. Part of this involves helping refugees access the labour market. Before the conflict, Syria boasted one of MENA's region's largest higher education systems. According to UNESCO, 26% of Syrians' young persons were participating in tertiary education before the conflict. Along with these students, approximately 8,000 faculty were teaching and conducting research. Despite this, accessing the job market can be extremely difficult for refugees in a new country. Among those in Europe who can get a job, only half of the refugee population could find work in 2014. Refugees have a higher risk of being unemployed, mostly because of the obvious language barrier, and if they're working, they're usually forced to work below their level of qualification. While employment outcomes for refugees improve over time, it can still take up to 20 years to catch up with native-born workers, which makes integrating into society, primarily by means of learning the host country's language, vital for refugees in a new state. Cologne's public library is one such place that offers language classes to aid refugees in the integration process. They do this through the Sparham, literally the language room. When I arrived, I had to ask a staff member to help me find the space, which ended up being a large ground floor room tucked away opposite the main library building. The Sparham serves as a meeting point and learning hub for the city's migrant community, opening in 2015, just before Germany experienced a mass influx of refugees. Today, around 15 teams use the room in the morning for their courses, and 55 volunteers come by in the afternoons to help migrants learn German. It's quiet when I arrive, but I see small clusters of refugees and workers around the room. In one corner, I see a pair reading over what looks to be a job application. And that's the thing. The Sparham does more than simply help refugees learn the new language. Currently, every Tuesday, the Sparham hosts a Writing for Work and Everyday Life workshop. Here, refugees can get help writing letters or completing job applications. The Sparham slogan is, "Get involved and learn together." We've talked a lot here about integration, but what does it really mean for someone to integrate into a new society? One of the biggest arguments the Hungarian government, who I spoke about in the last episode, makes against accepting more asylum seekers is that they bring with them a predominantly Muslim culture that is unable to blend with their traditional Christian culture. The fear is that they will create parallel societies with different cultural rules and norms. So, when someone arrives in a new country, should they forgo their cultural identity? Do they owe it to the country that accepted their asylum claim to transform themselves into as much of a citizen of that country as possible? When people talk about the need for refugees to integrate into society, what is it that they actually want? In her work in 2013, master's candidate Rebecca Nathanson wrote in her dissertation, "There is a distinction to be made between integrating refugees and assimilating them." To quote directly from her work, according to Merriam-Webster, the definition of assimilating is to absorb into the system, whereas to integrate means to form, coordinate, or blend into a functioning or unified whole. She goes on to write, "The experience of assimilating differs from integrating because it implies losing one's identity, which risks being absorbed into the system. Integration, on the other hand, makes room for a person's individual cultural values, practices, and identity." Here's an example. The common approach to integrating refugee children into an educational system focuses on getting the child proficient in English as quickly as possible, often at the expense of their native language. This is assimilation, not integration, and can reportedly result in the interrupted intellectual development and a breakdown of invaluable links to family and community. Nathanson writes, "Integration is the preferred experience, since it acknowledges the mutual relationship and impacts that refugees, immigrants, and individuals in the host culture have on each other." So, when people from a host country talk about refugees needing to accept the culture of their new country, are they talking about assimilation or integration? And which one would they actually prefer they do? To be a truly durable solution, and I'm quoting from the UNHCR here, resettlement must offer refugees the support and opportunities to facilitate their integration into the new community. At the local level, communities must be prepared to welcome and support resettled refugees, and opportunities to bring newcomers and their new community members together to build relationships and identify and address issues." End quote. So here's a tough question. Is the UN asking too much of local people by stating this? To ask people to open their hearts to individuals that they've never met, from places they may have never been, and offer unconditional support? Cologne itself has had its struggles over the years. On New Year's Eve in 2015, large-scale sexual assaults and thefts against women took place in numerous German cities.
Police say more than 1,000 men, many of them reportedly of Northern African and Middle Eastern descent, had gathered in front of the cathedral on New Year's Eve. They threw firecrackers into the crowds before splitting into groups and surrounding lone women, sexually assaulting and robbing them.
Among them was Cologne, where it was reported around 1,000 men appeared in the square between Cologne's iconic Gothic cathedral and the central train station and proceeded to corral, rob, and assault women. After that, facts and opinions get a bit messy. Police initially identified the subjects as up to 1,000 men of Middle Eastern origin, but later backtracked as public officials warned there was little information on whether those involved were migrants. A week later, it was acknowledged that asylum seekers were among the suspects. The police later released a report that 9 Algerians, 8 Moroccans, 5 Iranians, and 4 Syrians were among the 31 subjects. These events further stoked fears about security and culture clashes between those fleeing Muslim-majority countries and local Germans, who are confronting the costs of assimilating refugees. Those who had opposed Germany's open-door policy to asylum seekers saw in these attacks justification for their opposition and were not shy of saying so. Worries grew around accumulating hundreds of thousands of people from conservative Muslim societies, many of them young men who have had little experience with open European customs, particularly regarding women. Germany's culture of acceptance portrayed German citizens as being ready to open their arms and take on the social and economic costs of integration of newcomers, a cost that was estimated to be 50 billion by 2017. However, the continuous flow of arrivals, the difficulty of housing and integrating more than 1 million refugees, and the events of New Year's Eve have stoked skepticism within German society at large at both their ability and the refugees' ability to integrate together into a harmonious society, especially since the reality is these refugees will likely not be able to return home anytime soon. At the end of 2014, half of all refugees had been in exile for over 10 years. Here are my final thoughts. I think we need to acknowledge that integration is a two-way process, and that it requires effort from both newly arrived refugees to embrace a new culture, but also for hosts of said culture to welcome them in. It's a mutual relationship, and Cologne has started to show this, with some signs being written in Arabic and new integration programs popping up across the town. But there is always a strain on this relationship because of the varying ways individuals and groups define integration, whether it's creating a multicultural society or encouraging German norms and practices among refugees. And for some people, no matter the integration process, it will never be seen as enough. Next time on Motion, Borders. You can find a full transcript of this podcast, along with a bibliography and links to reference articles on Motion's website. Motion's music is produced by Kevin MacLeod. Thank you to Sarah Pollock for designing motions graphics.